Hello and welcome back to the Bruegel Sound of Economics podcast. I'm Nicholas Barrett and today I'm joined by our director, Guntram Wolff, and Guntram is just back from Helsinki, where he presented a new paper at the informal ECOFIN on Friday the 13th on hybrid and cybersecurity threats to the European Union's financial system. And the paper is co-authored by our Deputy Director Maria Demertzis. And that might sound complicated and it might sound new, and it is a very new threat. And I think it's the first time Guntram, the ECOFIN's ever discussed cyber threats. Am I right?
Yes, indeed. It's the first time.
So I read this paper and I found it absolutely fascinating and I learned a lot reading it. But I think to start with, I'm going to ask you to tell us the story of Fantasia.
Well, the story of Fantasia is how we start this paper. It's about a fictitious country called Fantasia, which is a member state of the Eurozone and the European Union, and which is actually subject to a variety of incidences. And these incidences include, first, a social media campaign against the minister of the country. Then there is an attack on the internet system, and the internet slows down. There is a social media campaign against a bank, leading to a bank run. And then there is a power blackout in the capital of the country. And in fact, in real time, none of the politicians, none of the people responsible in this country, Fantasia, actually understand what's going on. And in fact, even the neighboring country, which has many subsidiaries, so bank branches of the bank that was subject to a cyber attack or to a social media attack in Fantasia, even those people don't know and are getting worried that, in fact, their savings are under threat. And so the crisis propagates. And then we basically ask the question, well, what is it here? What's happening? Who in this moment would be able to analyze and understand what's going on? So who has the analytical capacities, the situational awareness, and the political capacity to actually understand what's going on in this case? And I think the sum of what I'm describing here is if all of these incidences happen more or less at the same time, we are in what is called a hybrid attack, which is basically an attack of a state or a non-state actor on a variety of institutions with the aim to disrupt activities, disrupt and undermine confidence in the entire country.
Yes, and the defining factor of a hybrid cybersecurity factor is that everything happens very quickly and all at once. And one of the aspects of your paper is that would expose to some degree the fragmented nature of Europe's security governance. So what did you learn while you were researching that?
Well, I think first of all, it's important to understand that this is not complete fiction. What I'm talking about, Fantasia is not fiction. I mean, we've had incidences that were quite similar to that one. We've had something of that sort in Estonia some time ago, and we reference the episode in the paper. And every of the individual incidences that I describe for Fantasia have happened. I mean, we've had social media campaigns against politicians. We've had social media fake news against the bank leading to a bank run. We've had actually a public sector being affected by data stealing and multiple millions of data being lost. And so this is actually not fantasy, but it's actually something that could happen. It's not a fantasy example, and something almost as bad has already happened. And I guess the question we then asked to the EU finance ministers is, well, if that were to happen, who would be in charge? How would you react? Would you be able to react? And what we learned from the literature review and from studying the European institutional architecture is that while we have a very integrated financial system, we have a very fragmented security system. So basically, finance is European, it's international, but if such a thing happens, it comes down to national security agencies, and those national security agencies will be put in charge. But those national security agencies, in fact, they don't see the whole picture. They don't see what's happening in the neighboring country, and they also don't even have a mandate to take into account the effects of their action on the neighboring countries. So clearly there is a gap here in terms of the level of high economic integration, but very little political cybersecurity security integration in the architecture of the European Union. And I think that raises multiple challenges.
And are these challenges for Brussels? Is this a European Union priority?
I think the European Union itself has put out a few communications highlighting the acute risk that hybrid threats, hybrid attacks pose to the EU and its member states. It is being actively discussed. And I think the issue certainly has moved up quite significantly on the list of priorities of policymakers, as can always also be seen by the fact that EU finance ministers have discussed this for the first time. So far, they have only discussed it at the G7 level, but not really at the EU level. So only the 7 advanced industrial economies, the G7 countries, have discussed this. And I think it's also really a higher priority than it used to be, because we document in this paper that there's a significant rise in the number of incidences of cyber attacks. So there's many more cyber attacks happening now than 5 or 10 years ago. And we show that these cyber attacks are actually more costly. I mean, they have a bigger impact. So clearly, I think this is something that should be high on the agenda and that has moved up, but perhaps not yet sufficiently.
And what are the practical aims and motivations of the people who carry out these attacks?
Well, that's a very good question. And I think one of the things to realize is that you don't know. I mean, you might not know even in years after. In real time, you might also not know. So it can be just criminal behavior. It could be profit motivation, but it could also be deliberate political attempts to determine elections, undermine confidence in a country, and so on and so forth. So there's a multitude of reasons. Cyber attacks are, as the saying goes, they are easy to do and they are easy to deny also. And so that's a very complicated set of issues, so that it's very difficult to detect actually in real time what's happening. So I think the key question for me really was then, well, I mean, we still don't know how likely it is and how big the chances are that something bad really happens. But if it happens, it's quite bad. So the key question is what can be done about it? I mean, can we strengthen our architecture? And that's then perhaps where the paper ends.
Well, perhaps you can tell us a little bit about some of your suggestions and how you settled upon those recommendations.
Yeah, I think we have a bunch of suggestions. I mean, from very practical suggestions of improving information sharing to standardizing the measurement and the classification of cyber attacks so as to allow a European insurance market for cyber risks to develop. So these are very sort of hands-on and practical things that I think are relatively easy to implement. The more complicated ones then concern, obviously, the whole discussion on the security architecture, where I mean the tendency is, of course, to keep it national, and it's one of the big national prerogatives. And there were even concerns, and there are even concerns that by classifying the financial system as a critical infrastructure, one might increase the pressure to actually nationalize the financial system again. I mean, this was a sort of important policy discussion, which sounds a little bit technical, but the basic idea is, I mean, we know that if the financial system breaks down, this has massive implications for the entire economic system and for actually our daily lives, right? I mean, even to issues like food supply and water supply, all of this can be affected. And so it is, in a sense, it is a critical infrastructure. I think most people would ultimately agree it's a critical infrastructure. But by classifying the financial system as a critical infrastructure, it becomes something that is primarily the responsibility of the national security authorities. And that in the end might mean that actually the financial system might have to be less international and more national. And that's, of course, very much resisted by the logic of the single market and the logic of the currency union. And so there's a tension here between the currency union actually requiring, and my financial system in principle requiring, wanting to be international, wanting to be global, but the security threats still being dealt with at the national level. So I think in the end, where we end up on this is saying, look, I mean, it would be very good if we could increase the level of cooperation across security agencies and even manage to strengthen the few institutions that we have at the European level to beef up the security capacities of those institutions. I mean, there's something called a hybrid fusion cell in the European External Action Service. So that's a sort of a center of intelligence. And it's still very, very small and weak, and that could be strengthened. And that's sort of where we end up on this paper.
So while nation states might be better able to act responsively to such threats, they're going to be overwhelmed unless they cooperate. And that's going to be the tension for policymakers to investigate in the months and years to come as the threat evolves.
Yeah, I mean, being overwhelmed, I think we all might be overwhelmed. We don't know, but the key is also not only that you could be overwhelmed, but the key is to have enough practice and to do enough exercises, including at the entire EU level, to be able to recover very quickly. So if something bad happens, have we opened the communication channels before? Do we know who has to call whom at what moment to be able to basically as quickly as possible recover from such a bad situation? That's why one recommendation we give is actually to perform an exercise at the EU 28 level, at the level of the finance ministers and central banks, so as to be able to practice for such incidences and be able to respond.
Well, Guntram, thank you very much for joining us. If you're interested in what you've heard, the paper is Hybrid and Cybersecurity Threats and the European Union's Financial System, and it's available to read on Bruegel.org. You've been listening to Deep Focus on the Sound of Economics podcast. Thank you for joining us, and we hope you'll hear us again soon.